The winter of 1872 hit Las Animas, Colorado, with a merciless fury that Frances Turner had never anticipated when she'd moved west with her husband 3 years prior. Now, as she collapsed onto her bed, her body burning with fever while her two small children cried in the next room, she wondered if this would be the winter that finally claimed them all. Frances pulled the thin blanket over her trembling body, her throat too raw to call out to 5-year-old William and 3-year-old Sarah. The children had been without a proper meal since yesterday morning, subsisting on dry biscuits and water. Her husband Nathaniel had been dead for 8 months, killed in a mining accident that left her alone with 2 children and a small homestead 10 miles outside of town. "Mama!" William's small voice called from the doorway. His dark hair was uncombed, his clothes rumpled from sleep. "Sarah's crying. She says her tummy hurts." Frances tried to sit up, but the room spun violently around her. I'll be there in a moment, sweet boy," she whispered, though she knew it was a lie. The fever that had started as a mild ache 2 days ago now consumed her entirely, leaving her barely able to lift her head from the pillow. "Are you still sick, Mama?" William asked, his lower lip trembling. "Just need a little rest," Frances managed, her eyelids heavy as lead. She heard Sarah's wails growing louder from the other room, but could do nothing to soothe her daughter. Darkness crept in at the edges of her vision, and the last thing she remembered was William's frightened face as she slipped into unconsciousness. Jacob Steele pulled his coat tighter against the biting wind as he guided his horse along the narrow trail. The cattle drive had ended early due to the unexpected snowstorm, and most of the men had headed for the saloons in town. But Jacob had promised Mrs. Patterson he'd check on her neighbor before the worst of the weather hit. "Just a widow woman and her little ones," Mrs. Patterson had said, pressing a sack of flour and some dried beans into his hands. "Nathaniel Turner died in the spring. Frances tries her best, but she's got no business being out here alone with those babies." Jacob had agreed more out of politeness than anything else. At 32, he'd spent most of his adult life avoiding entanglements, especially with women and children. The cowboy life suited him, riding the open range, sleeping under the stars, answerable to no one but himself and occasionally a trail boss. As he approached the small cabin, something seemed wrong. No smoke rose from the chimney despite the bitter cold, and the place had an eerily quiet feeling that raised the hair on his neck. His horse, Thunder, nickered nervously as they drew closer. "Easy, boy," Jacob murmured, dismounting and tying Thunder to a post. He approached the door and knocked firmly. "Mrs. Turner, it's Jacob Steele. Mrs. Patterson sent me to check on you." No answer came, but he heard what sounded like a child crying inside. Jacob knocked again, louder this time. "Mrs. Turner." The crying grew more distinct, and he heard small footsteps approaching the door. It opened a crack, and a small boy peered out, his face tear-streaked and dirty. "Are you here to help Mama?" the boy asked, his voice trembling. Jacob's chest tightened. "Is your mama sick, son?" The boy nodded, opening the door wider. "She won't wake up. Sarah's hungry and I don't know how to make food." Jacob stepped inside, removing his hat as he surveyed the humble cabin. A little girl sat on the floor near a cold stove, her face red from crying, clutching a rag doll to her chest. The air inside was nearly as cold as outside. "Where's your mama?" Jacob asked gently. The boy pointed to a doorway covered by a faded curtain. "She's been sleeping a long time." Jacob crossed the room in 3 long strides and pushed aside the curtain. On a narrow bed lay a young woman, her chestnut hair spread across the pillow, her face flushed with fever. Her breath came in shallow gasps. "Mrs. Turner." Jacob approached the bed, setting his hat aside. He placed a calloused hand on her forehead and nearly recoiled at the heat radiating from her skin. "Madam, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, but she didn't wake. Jacob cursed under his breath. The woman was burning up with fever, and from the looks of things, she'd been ill for some time. The children were clearly hungry and frightened, and night was falling fast. "William," the little girl called from the doorway. "I'm hungry." Jacob turned to see both children watching him, their eyes wide and uncertain. He'd never felt more out of his depth in his life. Trail cooking was one thing, but caring for sick women and hungry children was another matter entirely. "All right," he said, more to himself than to them. "First things first, let's get a fire going and see about some supper." The boy William apparently nodded solemnly. "Mama keeps the kindling in the box by the stove." Jacob got to work, moving with purpose to hide his uncertainty. He built a fire in the stove, grateful for his trail experience as the flames caught quickly. The cabin began to warm almost immediately, and he found a pot to fill with water from the barrel in the corner. "Your mama got any medicines?" he asked William as he rummaged through the sparse kitchen supplies. "In the blue tin on the shelf," William pointed. "She makes us drink the bad-tasting tea when we get sick." Jacob found the tin and sniffed the dried herbs inside. Willow bark and something else he couldn't identify. He'd seen the old trail cook make similar concoctions for ailing cowboys. "William, how long has your mama been sick?" The boy scrunched his face in concentration. "2 sleeps, I think. She couldn't get up yesterday, and today she won't talk to us. 2 days with no care, and probably longer since the children had eaten properly." Jacob set water to boil for the medicinal tea, then looked through the provisions Mrs. Patterson had sent, along with what little was in the Turner pantry. He could make a simple bean soup with some dried meat he had in his saddlebag. "You two sit at the table," he instructed, lifting the little girl Sarah and placing her on a chair. "I'm going to make something to eat, and then we'll try to help your mama." As he prepared the simple meal, Jacob felt the children's eyes on him, watching his every move. He wasn't used to being scrutinized this way, and it made him uncomfortable. On the trail, he kept to himself, doing his job without much talk, but these children needed reassurance. "My name's Jacob," he said as he chopped an onion. "I work with the cattle drives that come through. Your neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, asked me to check on you. Are you a doctor?" William asked hopefully. Jacob shook his head. "No, son, just a cowboy, but I've seen my share of trail fevers. We'll do what we can for your mama." The soup began to simmer, filling the cabin with a savory aroma. The tea for Frances steeped in a mug, and Jacob found a clean cloth to soak in cool water for her forehead. He served small bowls of soup to the children, making sure it wasn't too hot. "Eat slow now," he cautioned. "Your bellies need to get used to food again." As the children ate, Jacob took the tea and the cool cloth to Frances. He sat on the edge of the bed and gently lifted her head. "Mrs. Turner, I need you to drink this. It'll help with the fever." Frances's eyes opened slightly, unfocused and glassy. "Nathaniel," she whispered. "No, madam." "My name's Jacob Steele. I'm here to help." He pressed the mug to her lips, and to his relief, she took a small sip, then another. "My children," she murmured between sips, "they're fine, having some supper now." He helped her drink the entire mug, then laid the cool cloth across her forehead. "You rest. I'll look after things." Frances closed her eyes again, seemingly comforted by his assurance. Jacob returned to the kitchen to find both children had emptied their bowls. "Is Mama going to be all right?" William asked, his voice small. Jacob nodded with more confidence than he felt. "Your Mama's strong. She just needs rest and care." He glanced outside at the darkening sky and the snow beginning to fall. "Looks like I'll be staying the night to help out." After washing the dishes, Jacob settled the children for bed. awkwardly tucking blankets around them in the small trundle bed they shared. Sarah insisted on a story, and though Jacob had never told a bedtime tale in his life, he managed a simplified version of a cattle drive that seemed to satisfy her. Once the children were asleep, Jacob checked on Frances again. Her fever hadn't broken, but she seemed to be resting more comfortably. He replaced the cloth on her forehead with a fresh, cool one and gave her more water. He then made his own bed on the floor near the stove, using his bedroll from his saddlebag. As he lay there, listening to the wind howl outside, Jacob wondered what he'd gotten himself into. He was supposed to be on his way to Dodge City by now, looking for work with the spring cattle drives. Instead, he was playing nursemaid to a sick woman and her children. But as he drifted off to sleep, he couldn't help feeling that he was exactly where he needed to be. Jacob woke at dawn, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The events of the previous day came rushing back as he heard a small cough from the children's bed. He rose quickly, stoked the fire, and put water on to boil. Frances still burned with fever when he checked on her, though she seemed more lucid than the night before. Her eyes fluttered open as he placed a fresh cloth on her forehead. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Jacob Steele, madam. I came by yesterday at Mrs. Patterson's request." He helped her take a sip of water. "You've got a bad fever." Frances tried to sit up, panic in her eyes. "My children are fine," Jacob assured her, gently pressing her back against the pillow. "They're still sleeping. I gave them supper last night and made sure they were warm." Relief washed over her face, followed by embarrassment. "I'm sorry for the trouble. I thought I could fight off the fever myself." "No trouble, madam, but you need rest and medicine. I'll make you more tea." As he turned to leave, Frances caught his hand. Her skin was hot against his, but her grip was surprisingly strong. "Thank you, Mr. Steele." Something in her eyes, gratitude mixed with a fierce determination, stirred something in Jacob he thought long buried. He nodded awkwardly and withdrew his hand. The children woke soon after, and Jacob found himself making breakfast oatmeal sweetened with the last of Frances's honey. William helped by setting the table, while Sarah chattered about a dream involving a horse that could fly. "Is Mama better?" William asked as they ate. "She's awake, which is good," Jacob answered honestly, "but the fever's still strong. She needs more rest." After breakfast, Jacob faced a new challenge. The children needed washing and their clothes were dirty. He filled a basin with warm water and, with William's help, showed Sarah how to wash her face and hands. The boy proudly demonstrated that he could wash himself, though Jacob had to help with the back of his neck. Clean clothes were another matter. Jacob found a trunk with neatly folded children's garments and helped them change, feeling entirely out of his element as he fumbled with buttons and ties. Throughout the morning, he checked on Frances regularly, bringing her tea and broth when she could take it. By midday, her fever seemed marginally lower, but she was still too weak to leave the bed. "The children," she said when he brought her more broth. "They must be frightened." "They're tougher than you think," Jacob replied. "William's been helping me. And Sarah's been keeping us entertained with stories." A ghost of a smile crossed Frances's pale face. "She has quite an imagination." "That she does." Jacob hesitated. "Mrs. Turner, I need to check on my horse and bring in more firewood. Will you be all right for a bit?" "Of course." She looked embarrassed again. "Mr. Steele, I can't express how grateful I am, but surely you have other obligations. You needn't stay on our account." Jacob thought of his original plans: the long ride to Dodge, the uncertain prospect of work, the solitary nights around campfires with other drifting men. Somehow, none of it seemed as important as it had 2 days ago. "No place I need to be, madam, and the weather's turned bad. Better to wait it out." It wasn't exactly a lie. Snow had been falling steadily since dawn. He bundled up and went outside to tend to Thunder, who nickered in greeting. The horse seemed content in the small lean-to beside the cabin, though Jacob felt guilty for not checking on him sooner. "Sorry, old friend," he murmured, rubbing Thunder's nose. "Been a bit busy." After feeding and watering his horse, Jacob chopped more firewood from the dwindling pile near the cabin. The physical labor felt good after the confines of the small home. As he worked, he considered the situation. Frances's fever would likely break in another day or two if they were lucky, but she'd be weak for some time afterward. The children needed care, and the homestead needed attention. The chicken coop, he'd noticed, was in disrepair, and there were other chores that had clearly been neglected as Frances fell ill. Jacob wasn't sure why he felt so responsible for this small family, but something inside him rebelled at the thought of leaving them vulnerable. Perhaps it was the memory of his own mother, who died of fever when he was 10, with no one to help her but a frightened boy. When he returned to the cabin with an armload of wood, he found William attempting to sweep the floor while Sarah sang a made-up song to her doll. "Mr. Jacob," William said earnestly, "I'm cleaning like Mama shows me." "Good job, partner." Jacob set down the wood and took off his coat. "Your Mama will be mighty pleased to see how well you're taking care of things." The boy beamed at the praise, and Jacob felt an unexpected warmth in his chest. He'd never given much thought to having children of his own, but there was something about William's serious little face and Sarah's infectious giggle that made him wonder what he'd been missing all these years. By evening, Frances's fever had risen again, concerning Jacob deeply. He'd seen trail fevers take strong men in days. After getting the children to bed with another improvised story, he sat beside Frances, bathing her face and neck with cool water as she tossed restlessly. "Fight it, Mrs. Turner," he murmured as he worked. "Those little ones need you." Frances's eyes opened, clearer than before despite the fever. "Frances," she whispered, "please call me Frances, Frances." Her name felt right on his lips. "I'm Jacob, I know." A faint smile touched her mouth before her eyes closed again. "You tell terrible stories, Jacob," he chuckled despite his worry. "Never claimed to be good at it." "Tell me one," she murmured. "Might help me sleep." Jacob hesitated. He wasn't a storyteller, and the only tales he knew were hardly suitable for a lady's ears. Rough stories of cattle drives, barroom brawls, and the hardships of the trail. But Frances was waiting, her eyes closed but her expression expectant. "Well," he began awkwardly, "I was driving cattle through the Llano Estacado that's down in Texas about 5 years back. Flattest, most desolate country you ever saw." He found himself telling her about a nighttime stampede, how the sky had been so full of stars it looked like diamond dust scattered across black velvet, how the thunder of hooves had shaken the earth, and how he'd ridden harder than he ever had to turn the lead steer. "Were you afraid?" Frances asked softly when he paused. "Terrified," Jacob admitted. "But there wasn't time to think about it. Just had to ride and trust Thunder to keep his footing in the dark. Thunder, my horse, had him since he was a colt, best partner a man could ask for." "I had a horse once," Frances said, her voice dreamy with fever. "A chestnut mare named Penny, before we came west. Nathaniel sold her to pay for the wagon." Something in her tone made Jacob wonder if she'd forgiven her late husband for that particular decision. He continued his story, embellishing certain parts to make it more entertaining, until he noticed Frances had fallen into a deeper, more peaceful sleep. Jacob spent most of the night keeping watch over her, dozing in the chair beside her bed. By morning, her fever had broken at last. When he touched her forehead, it was cool and slightly damp. Frances opened her eyes, lucid for the first time since he'd arrived. "The children?" she asked immediately, still sleeping. "They're fine." Frances pushed herself up slightly against the pillows, weak but determined. "How long have you been here, Jacob?" "This is the 3rd day," he replied, helping her take a sip of water. "3 days," she repeated, looking troubled. "You've cared for my children all this time, and me," Jacob nodded, suddenly self-conscious. "The fever was bad." "You couldn't have managed alone." Frances looked down at her nightgown, then back at him with a blush rising in her cheeks. "Did you?" "No, Madam Frances," Jacob said quickly. "Just brought you water and tea and cool cloths for your head, nothing improper." Relief softened her features. "Thank you, not just for that, but for everything. My children would have." She couldn't finish the sentence. "They're good kids. Smart, too. William's been a real helper." Frances smiled at that, and Jacob was struck by how it transformed her face. Even pale and weak from fever, she was beautiful not in the painted, showy way of saloon girls, but with a natural grace that made his breath catch. "Mama!" Sarah's excited cry came from the doorway, and a moment later the little girl had scrambled onto the bed and into her mother's arms. William followed more cautiously, but his face lit up when he saw Frances sitting up. "You're better," he exclaimed. "I am, thanks to Mr. Steele." Frances hugged her children close, her eyes meeting Jacob's over their heads. "He took very good care of all of us." "He makes soup," William reported seriously. "And he let us help feed the chickens, and he tells stories about cows." "Cattle," Jacob corrected automatically, then felt foolish. Frances laughed, a sound that seemed to brighten the entire cabin. "Cattle, of course. Much more dignified." Jacob stood, suddenly aware of his rumpled appearance and 3-day beard. "I should let you rest with your little ones. I'll make some breakfast." In the kitchen, Jacob took a moment to collect himself. Frances Turner, awake and alert, was far more disconcerting than Frances Turner, unconscious with fever. Her smile, her laugh, the way she looked at him with such genuine gratitude, it all stirred feelings he'd long since buried under years of solitary wandering. He busied himself preparing breakfast, using the last of the eggs he'd gathered from the henhouse yesterday. The provisions were running low, and he'd need to make a trip into town soon if he was going to stay and help until Frances was stronger. And he was going to stay, he realized. At least for a while. The thought of riding away and leaving them to manage alone was unthinkable. After breakfast, Frances insisted on sitting up in a chair in the main room, wrapped in blankets. She was still weak, but her determination was evident in every careful movement. "You should rest more," Jacob admonished as he helped her to the chair. "I've rested enough," she replied firmly. "Besides, I can't let you do everything. You must have your own responsibilities, your own life to get back to." Jacob shrugged. "Winter's a slow time for cowboys. Most of the men hole up in town until spring brings the next drives." He didn't mention that he usually wintered in Dodge or Wichita, taking odd jobs and saving his money for the lean times. Frances studied him with intelligent eyes. "But you had plans before you found us. Where were you headed?" "Dodge City," he admitted. "But that trail will still be there when the snow clears." Frances looked troubled. "I can't ask you to delay your journey. We've imposed enough." "You didn't ask. I'm offering." Jacob busied himself with the fire to avoid her gaze. "Truth is, I've been drifting so long. A few more weeks in one place might do me good." Before Frances could respond, Sarah tugged at Jacob's pant leg. "Can we make a snowman? William says the snow is good for packing." Jacob glanced at Frances, who nodded with a small smile. "Bundle them up well," she said. "There are mittens in the trunk." The morning passed pleasantly as Jacob helped the children build not one but 3 small snowmen in the yard. Frances watched from the window, her color improving as the day went on. By afternoon, she felt strong enough to help prepare a simple stew from the remaining provisions. "I need to go to town tomorrow," Jacob said as they ate dinner together. "We're running low on supplies." "I have a little money," Francis began, but Jacob shook his head. "I've got enough. Been saving my wages from the last cattle drive." He hesitated. "Is there anything special you or the children need?" Francis looked embarrassed. "We don't need charity, Mr. Steele. It's not charity, it's—" He searched for the right words. "It's what neighbors do. Help each other through hard times." "Are you our neighbor now, Mr. Jacob?" William asked innocently. Jacob ruffled the boy's hair. "For the time being, I reckon I am." That night, after the children were asleep, Jacob and Francis sat by the fire. She was stronger than in the morning, but still wrapped in a blanket against the chill. "Tell me about yourself, Jacob," she said softly. "A man doesn't become a drifting cowboy without a story." Jacob stared into the flames. He wasn't used to talking about himself, especially not the past he'd left behind. But there was something about Francis's gentle presence that made him want to open up. "Not much to tell. Grew up in Missouri. Pa had a small farm, but it never prospered. Ma died when I was 10. Pa followed 5 years later." He poked at the fire with a stick. "Sold what little we had and headed west. Been working cattle drives ever since." "No family. No one waiting for you somewhere." Jacob shook his head. "Never stayed in one place long enough. Trail life doesn't lend itself to putting down roots." Francis was quiet for a moment. "Don't you get lonely?" The question caught him off guard. Loneliness was such a constant companion that he'd almost stopped noticing it, like the creak of saddle leather or the smell of trail dust. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but it's a simpler life. No complications. No joy either," Francis observed. "No children's laughter or someone to share your thoughts with at the end of the day." Jacob looked at her then, really looked at her. The firelight cast a warm glow on her face, highlighting the gentle curve of her cheek, the thoughtful set of her mouth. Her chestnut hair, freed from its usual practical bun, fell in waves around her shoulders. She couldn't be more than 25 or 26, yet her eyes held a wisdom born of hardship. "What about you?" he asked, deflecting attention from himself. "How did you end up homesteading out here alone?" Francis sighed. "Nathaniel had big dreams. He grew up in Boston, the youngest son of a merchant, no inheritance coming his way, so he decided to seek his fortune in the West." A wry smile touched her lips. "I was 18, naive and deeply in love with his grand visions. We married against my parents' wishes and headed west with everything we owned." "When was this?" 3 years ago. William was just a toddler and I was carrying Sarah." She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "The journey was harder than either of us expected. Nathaniel wasn't prepared for the realities of frontier life. He thought we'd strike it rich quickly, gold or silver or land speculation. When that didn't happen, he took work at the mine." Jacob nodded, understanding the rest without being told. Mining was dangerous work, especially for men not raised to hard physical labor. "After the accident, I considered going back east," Francis continued. "But my parents had made it clear they wouldn't welcome us, and the journey would have taken every penny of Nathaniel's death benefit. So we stayed." "You're a strong woman, Francis Turner," Jacob said quietly. She laughed, but there was little humor in it. "Not strong enough, apparently, if you hadn't come when you did." "But I did come," Jacob said simply. "And now we both need rest. Tomorrow will be a busy day." As Jacob settled onto his bedroll near the stove, he found himself more reluctant than ever to return to his solitary existence. 3 days with Francis and her children had awakened something in him he'd forgotten existed, a yearning for connection, for purpose beyond the next trail drive. The ride to Las Animas the next morning was cold but clear. The snow had stopped, and the winter sun glinted off the white landscape. Jacob had left at dawn, promising to return by afternoon. Frances had pressed a list into his hand, modest needs that spoke volumes about her careful management of limited resources. In town, Jacob first visited the general store, where Mrs. Patterson happened to be selecting fabric. "Mr. Steele," she exclaimed when she saw him. "I was beginning to worry. How are the Turners?" "Mrs. Turner had a bad fever, but she's recovering now," Jacob replied, handing Frances's list to the storekeeper. "The children are well." "Thank the Lord you got there when you did," Mrs. Patterson said fervently. "That poor woman has more backbone than sense sometimes, trying to manage everything alone." While the storekeeper filled Frances's order, Jacob added several items not on the list: sugar, coffee, canned peaches, and a small bag of peppermint candies for the children. He also purchased flour, salt pork, and other staples in quantities that would last well beyond his planned stay. "You planning to winter there, Mr. Steele?" the storekeeper asked with raised eyebrows as he tallied the bill. "Just making sure they're set for a while," Jacob replied, ignoring the knowing look that passed between the man and Mrs. Patterson. His next stop was the doctor's office, where he described Frances's symptoms to the elderly physician. "Sounds like she's past the worst of it," Dr. Miller said. "But she'll need to take it easy for at least another week. No strenuous work." He prepared a tonic for Frances and advised Jacob on her care. "Keep her warm, make sure she eats, even if she doesn't feel hungry." By the time Jacob had finished his errands, including purchasing feed for the chickens and Thunder, his saddlebags and a borrowed pack mule were loaded with supplies. As he prepared to leave town, the sheriff hailed him from across the street. "Steele, isn't it? Patterson's ranch." Sheriff Davis approached, thumbs hooked in his belt. "That's right," Jacob confirmed, wary of the lawman's interest. "Heard you've been staying out at the Turner place." The sheriff's tone was casual, but his eyes were assessing. "Mrs. Turner's been ill. I've been helping out." The sheriff nodded slowly. "Proper thing to do. Frances is well respected around here. Brave woman carrying on after Nathaniel's passing." He cleared his throat. "Just so you know, folks in this town look out for their own, especially widows and children." Jacob understood the warning for what it was. "As they should, Sheriff. I respect that. Good. See that you do." With a tip of his hat, the sheriff moved on, leaving Jacob with the distinct impression that his actions were now under community scrutiny. The return journey took longer due to the laden mule, and the sun was beginning to set as Jacob approached the Turner homestead. Smoke rose cheerfully from the chimney, and he could see lamplight through the windows. The sight stirred an unfamiliar feeling in him, something close to homecoming. William spotted him first, running out into the yard despite the cold. "Mr. Jacob's back," he shouted, waving excitedly. Frances appeared in the doorway, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She looked steadier on her feet than when he'd left, though still pale. "You shouldn't be standing in the cold," Jacob admonished as he dismounted. "I'm much better," she assured him. "Come in quickly. We've kept supper warm." Inside, the cabin was warm and surprisingly tidy. Frances had clearly been busy during his absence, despite her weakness. The table was set, and a pot of something aromatic simmered on the stove. "You shouldn't have exerted yourself," Jacob said as he removed his coat. "I'm not an invalid," Frances replied with gentle firmness. "Besides, the children helped. Sarah is quite the little housekeeper already." The little girl beamed at the praise, twirling in her clean pinafore. "I swept the floor all by myself, and I carried the water," William added proudly. Jacob smiled at their enthusiasm. "Well, I brought something for such helpful children." He reached into his pocket and produced the bag of peppermint candies. The children's eyes widened, and after a questioning glance at their mother and her nod of permission, they each took a piece with solemn thank yous. "You didn't need to do that," Frances said softly as the children enjoyed their treats. "I know," Jacob replied, "but I wanted to." After supper, as Jacob brought in the supplies from the Mule and Thunder, he found Frances examining the quantities with a troubled expression. "Jacob, this is far too much," she said when he returned with the last load. "I can't possibly accept all this." "It's already here," he pointed out reasonably, "and it'll keep. The children need proper food to stay healthy." Frances bit her lip. "I'll pay you back. When the garden comes in this spring, I can sell vegetables in town, and Frances," Jacob interrupted gently. "It's a gift, no strings attached." "I don't take charity," she said, her chin lifting slightly. Jacob sighed. "It's not charity when it's—" He trailed off, not sure how to define what this was. "When it's what?" Frances prompted, her eyes searching his. "When it's friends helping each other," he finished awkwardly. A small smile curved her lips. "Friends," she repeated. "Is that what we are, Jacob Steele?" There was something in her voice, a hint of teasing mixed with genuine question, that made his heart beat faster. "I'd like to think so," he said carefully. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities, until Sarah's call for a bedtime story broke the tension. The next week passed in a rhythm that became increasingly comfortable. Jacob repaired the chicken coop, chopped enough firewood to last until spring, and began work on a broken wheel on Frances's wagon. The children followed him everywhere, William solemnly handing him tools while Sarah chattered endlessly about everything from her doll's imaginary adventures to the clouds she thought looked like horses. Frances regained her strength gradually, insisting on resuming more of her household duties each day despite Jacob's protests. They fell into an easy partnership, with Jacob handling the heavier outside work while Frances managed the home and children. In the evenings, they sat by the fire after the children were asleep, talking long into the night. Jacob learned that Frances had been a schoolteacher before her marriage, and she still taught her children their letters and numbers each day. She was well-read and thoughtful, with opinions on everything from politics to literature. In turn, he found himself sharing stories of his travels that he'd never told anyone: the beauty of a New Mexico sunrise, the terror of crossing a flooded river with 2,000 cattle, the camaraderie of men who depended on each other for survival. "You've seen so much," Frances said one evening, her voice tinged with something like longing. "Sometimes I feel as though the world is passing me by out here." "It's a hard life," Jacob acknowledged, "but there's beauty in it too, the way the hills turn green after spring rain. The first wildflowers, even the winter has its moments." He nodded toward the window where moonlight illuminated the snow-covered landscape. Frances followed his gaze. "I forget to look sometimes. There's always so much work, so many worries." She sighed. "Nathaniel used to say I was too practical for my own good, that I needed to dream more." "Nothing wrong with being practical," Jacob said. "Dreams don't feed children or fix wagon wheels." "No, but they feed the soul." Frances looked at him thoughtfully. "What are your dreams, Jacob?" "Surely you want more than endless cattle drives." The question caught him off guard. He'd stopped dreaming long ago, focused instead on survival and the next job. But sitting here in this warm cabin, with Frances's perceptive eyes on him, he found himself wondering what he did want. "I suppose," he said slowly, "I've thought about having a small ranch someday. Nothing grand, just enough land for some cattle, a garden, a place of my own." "Sounds lovely," Frances said softly. "A home." The word hung in the air between them, laden with meaning. Home. Jacob hadn't had one since his parents died, hadn't allowed himself to want one. But now, looking at Frances in the firelight, he could almost picture it: a life here, with her and the children, building something that would last. The thought both terrified and exhilarated him. 2 weeks after Jacob's arrival, Frances was fully recovered, and the weather had improved enough that the trails would soon be passable. They both knew his stated reason for staying was coming to an end, but neither had broached the subject of his departure. On a clear, cold morning, Jacob was repairing a fence when he saw a rider approaching. As the man drew closer, Jacob recognized Sheriff Davis from town. "Morning, Steele," the sheriff called, reining in his horse. "Sheriff." Jacob nodded in greeting, setting aside his hammer. "What brings you out this way, checking on folks after the bad weather?" Davis dismounted, tying his horse to the fence post. "How's Mrs. Turner faring?" "Much better. Fully recovered now." The sheriff studied Jacob's face. "That's good to hear. You've been here, 3 weeks now?" "Thereabouts." Jacob met the man's gaze steadily. Davis looked toward the cabin, then back at Jacob. "Mrs. Patterson mentioned you were just passing through. On your way to Dodge City, she said. Plans change." "So I see." The sheriff rocked back on his heels. "Mrs. Turner's a fine woman. Respected in the community." Jacob tensed, sensing the direction of the conversation. "I'm well aware of that, Sheriff." "Are you now?" Davis's voice hardened slightly. "Because from where I stand, it doesn't look proper a single man staying at a widow's home for weeks on end. People talk, Steele." Anger flared in Jacob's chest, but he kept his voice level. "Nothing improper has happened, Sheriff. I've been helping with repairs, that's all." "Maybe so. But it's time to move on, don't you think? Before folks start wondering about your intentions." The sheriff's hand rested casually near his holster. "Unless those intentions include a visit to the preacher." Before Jacob could respond, the cabin door opened, and Frances emerged with Sarah on her hip. She approached them, her expression curious but wary. "Sheriff Davis," she greeted him. "What a surprise. Won't you come in for coffee?" The sheriff tipped his hat. "Thank you, Mrs. Turner, but I can't stay long. Just checking that you're well after your illness. As you can see, I'm fully recovered thanks to Mr. Steele's assistance." Her voice was polite but cool, and she moved to stand beside Jacob, a deliberate statement that wasn't lost on the sheriff. Davis looked between them, his expression softening slightly. "Glad to hear it, madam. You've had more than your share of hardship." He cleared his throat. "Well, I should continue my rounds. Good day to you both." As the sheriff rode away, Frances turned to Jacob. "What was that about?" Jacob hesitated, not wanting to repeat the sheriff's insinuations. He was concerned about propriety, me staying here. Understanding dawned in Frances's eyes, followed by a flush of embarrassment. "Oh, I see." She set Sarah down, telling her to go find William. Once the child was out of earshot, Frances continued, "I didn't consider what people might think." "It doesn't matter what people think," Jacob said, more forcefully than he intended. "But it does," Frances countered gently. "Especially for a widow with young children. My reputation affects them too." Jacob knew she was right, and the realization settled like a stone in his stomach. Despite the contentment he'd found here, despite the growing feelings he could no longer deny, his presence was potentially harmful to the very woman he wanted to protect. "I should go," he said quietly. Frances looked away, her profile etched against the winter landscape. "Yes, I suppose you should." Her voice was steady, but her hands twisted together in front of her. That evening, an uncomfortable silence hung over the dinner table. The children sensed the change in atmosphere, their usual chatter subdued. After they were in bed, Jacob helped Frances with the dishes, both of them moving mechanically, avoiding each other's eyes. "I'll leave in the morning," Jacob finally said as he dried the last plate. "The trail to Dodge should be clear enough now." Frances nodded, her back to him as she wiped down the stove. "You've done more than enough for us. We'll manage fine now." "Frances." The sound of her name made her turn, her eyes meeting his reluctantly. "I don't want to go." The simple admission hung between them. Frances's hand stilled on the cloth she held. "What are you saying, Jacob?" "I'm saying that these weeks have been." He struggled for words. "They've been the happiest I can remember, being here with you and the children." "For us as well," Frances said softly. "The children adore you." "And you?" The question escaped before he could consider its wisdom. Frances's eyes widened slightly, her cheeks flushing. "I value your friendship greatly." It wasn't the answer he'd hoped for, but it wasn't a rejection either. Jacob took a step toward her. "The sheriff mentioned something about intentions and preachers." "Did he?" Frances's voice was barely above a whisper. "He did." Jacob took another step, close enough now to see the pulse fluttering in her throat. "It got me thinking." "About what?" "About staying. Not just for now, but—" He took a deep breath. "For good." Frances's eyes searched his. "Jacob, if you're suggesting what I think you are, you need to be certain. My children and I are a package. We come with responsibilities, challenges. It's not the free life you're accustomed to." "I know exactly what I'm suggesting," Jacob said, his voice stronger now. "And I've never been more certain of anything. The free life, as you call it, is lonely, Frances. Empty. What I've found here with you is worth more than any freedom." Tears welled in Frances's eyes. "You barely know me." "I know enough." Jacob reached for her hand, relieved when she didn't pull away. "I know you're strong and kind and stubborn as a mule sometimes. I know you love your children fiercely. I know your laugh makes me feel like I've come home after years of wandering." He squeezed her hand gently. "The rest we can learn together, if you'll have me." A tear slipped down Frances's cheek. "The children need stability, Jacob. They've already lost one father. I can't let them become attached to another man who might leave when the open road calls again." "I won't leave," Jacob promised. "Frances, look at me." He waited until her eyes met his. "I love you. I love William and Sarah. I want to build a life here with all of you." Frances's breath caught. "You love me with all my heart, though I know I haven't earned the right to say it yet." Frances was quiet for so long that Jacob began to fear he'd overstepped. But then she reached up, her hand trembling slightly as she touched his cheek. "You earned that right the moment you stepped into this cabin and cared for my children when I couldn't. When you chose to stay day after day, asking nothing in return." Hope surged in Jacob's chest. "Does that mean—" "It means I love you too," Frances whispered. "God help me, I tried not to. It seemed too soon, too convenient. But the heart doesn't follow proper timelines, does it?" Jacob laughed softly, joy bubbling up inside him. "No, it surely doesn't." He bent his head, and Frances rose to meet him, their lips coming together in a kiss that felt like the beginning of everything. Her arms wound around his neck as he pulled her closer, the warmth of her body against his chasing away the last of the winter's chill. When they finally parted, both breathless, Frances rested her forehead against his chest. "The sheriff will be insufferably smug about this," she murmured. Jacob chuckled. "Let him be, he was right. About your intentions, absolutely." Jacob tipped her chin up to look into her eyes. "Frances Turner, will you marry me? Let me be a father to your children, a partner in your life. Let me build a home with you right here." Frances's smile was radiant. "Yes, Jacob Steele. Yes to all of it." The wedding took place 2 weeks later in the small church in Las Animas. Mrs. Patterson had helped Frances alter one of her better dresses, adding lace from her own wedding gown to the collar and cuffs. The entire town turned out, curious about the drifting cowboy who had won the heart of their widowed schoolteacher. William stood proudly beside Jacob during the ceremony, taking his role as man of the family seriously, as he symbolically gave his mother away. Sarah scattered wildflowers, Mrs. Patterson had forced in her greenhouse, twirling down the aisle in a new dress that Frances had stayed up nights to finish. Sheriff Davis, to Jacob's surprise, was among the first to congratulate them. "Knew you were a man of honor from the start, Steele," he said, pumping Jacob's hand. "Just had to make sure." "Of course you did," Jacob replied dryly, but without rancor. He understood now that the community's protectiveness toward Frances and her children came from genuine care. That night, after celebrating with their neighbors and putting the exhausted children to bed, Jacob and Frances stood on the porch of their cabin, their home, looking out at the star-filled sky. "Happy, Mrs. Steele?" Jacob asked, his arm around her waist. Frances leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. "Happier than I ever thought I'd be again," she admitted, but also a little frightened. Of what? Of how quickly life can change, how fragile happiness can be. She turned in his arms to face him. "Promise me something, Jacob." "Anything. Promise me that no matter what challenges come, and they will come, we'll face them together. No running, no shutting each other out." Jacob cupped her face in his hands. "I promise. Together always." He sealed the vow with a kiss, deep and tender, full of promise for the future they would build. Spring brought new beginnings to the Turner, now Steele homestead. Jacob used his savings to purchase additional acreage adjoining their property and a small herd of cattle to start their ranch. Frances planted an expanded garden, planning to sell vegetables in town as she'd always intended. The children thrived under Jacob's care. William followed him everywhere, soaking up knowledge about ranching and riding with an eagerness that made Jacob's chest swell with pride. Sarah appointed herself helper to Mama and Papa, insisting on being involved in every aspect of their daily life. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Frances took Jacob's hand and placed it on her stomach. "I have something to tell you," she said, her eyes shining. Jacob's heart skipped. "Are you?" Frances nodded. "Dr. Miller confirmed it yesterday. The baby should arrive by early spring." Joy washed over Jacob in a wave so powerful it brought tears to his eyes. He gathered Frances into his arms, holding her as if she were made of precious glass. "A baby," he whispered against her hair. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" Frances asked, though she could surely feel the answer in the trembling of his hands. "Beyond words." Jacob drew back to look at her, his eyes wet. "Did you tell the children yet?" "I thought we should tell them together." They called William and Sarah from where they were playing in the yard. The children came running, faces flushed with exertion and the simple joy of childhood. "We have news," Frances said, kneeling to be at their eye level. "Next spring you're going to have a little brother or sister." Sarah's eyes widened in wonder. "A baby! Where is it?" "In Mama's tummy," Jacob explained, crouching beside Frances. "It's very tiny right now, but it's growing every day." William looked thoughtful. "Will you still love us when the baby comes?" he asked, his voice small. Jacob put his hand on the boy's shoulder. "William, our love doesn't divide. When it's shared, it multiplies. Your Mama and I will love you and Sarah just as much as ever, and we'll all love the new baby together." The boy considered this, then nodded solemnly. "I'll help take care of it. I'm good at helping." "Yes, you are," Frances agreed, pulling him into a hug. "The very best helper." Later that night, with the children asleep and Frances nestled against him in bed, Jacob reflected on the extraordinary turn his life had taken. A little over 6 months ago, he'd been a solitary drifter with nothing but his horse and the clothes on his back, heading for another lonely winter in Dodge City. Now he was a husband, a father to 2 children with another on the way, and the owner of a small but growing ranch. "What are you thinking about?" Frances murmured sleepily against his chest. "About how one decision can change everything," Jacob replied, stroking her hair. "If Mrs. Patterson hadn't asked me to check on you that day." "Or if you'd said no," Frances added. "I almost did," Jacob confessed. "I nearly rode straight for Dodge." Frances lifted her head to look at him. "What made you say yes?" Jacob considered the question. "Instinct maybe, or fate, or just plain luck." He smiled, tracing the curve of her cheek with his finger. "Whatever it was, I thank God for it every day." "As do I," Frances whispered, pressing a kiss to his palm. "Every single day." In the years that followed, the Steele ranch prospered. Their son, Michael, was born on a clear spring morning, with Mrs. Patterson serving as midwife when the doctor couldn't arrive in time. 2 years later, a daughter they named Elizabeth joined their growing family. Jacob never returned to the drifting life. The open road held no appeal compared to the joy of watching his children grow, working beside Frances to build their home and ranch, and falling deeper in love with her with each passing day. Sometimes on summer evenings, they would sit together on the porch after the children were asleep, just as they had that first night Jacob had arrived. Frances would rest her head on his shoulder and they would talk about their day, their dreams for the children, the plans for the ranch. "Do you ever regret it?" Frances asked him once, many years later. "Settling down, taking on a ready-made family." Jacob looked at her, at the lines that years of laughter and occasional tears had etched around her eyes, at the strand of gray now threading through her chestnut hair, and felt the same surge of love he'd experienced the first time she'd smiled at him. "Not for a single moment," he said truthfully. "That fever of yours was the best thing that ever happened to me." Frances laughed, the sound still as captivating as it had been on that winter day long ago when she'd first begun to heal. "Only you would see it that way, Jacob Steele." "Well," he said, pulling her close, "I've always believed that sometimes what seems like misfortune is just happiness in disguise. You just have to be willing to recognize it when it comes knocking. And stay when it invites you in," Frances added softly. "And stay," Jacob agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Always stay." As the sun set over their land, painting the sky in colors no artist could capture, Jacob reflected that this moment, this woman, this life they'd built together was worth every hard mile he'd traveled to find it. From drifting cowboy to husband, father, and rancher, his journey had led him exactly where he was meant to be all along: home.